All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Letters of Recommendation workshop. Um, First things first, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and look at the link in the chat and please sign in. There are going to be a couple of questions on there. It's just to gather information so that we kind of know who we're serving, and then we can, strategize about how better to serve y'all, right? So please fill that out when you get a chance. Okay, so my name is Amanda Kong. I'm one of your pre-health advisors here at the University of Oregon. I'll go ahead and let Sonia introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Sonia Gordillo. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I'm one of the other pre-health advisors here in Tykeson.
All right. Oh, yes, I also use she, her pronouns. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started then. Okay, letters of recommendation. What are they? Number one, a huge source of anxiety for students, right? This is definitely one of the trickiest parts of the application. It's pretty necessary, though, for pretty much any grad school application you're ever going to want to do, right? So there are a couple of different types of letters of recommendation. You might see the term committee letter and letter packet floating around out there. We're not really going to spend too much time on them because we don't do those here at UO, right? We only do individual letter, right? So you're going to have to reach out to individual faculty members and ask them to write a letter or, professional references and ask them to write a letter based on their experiences with you. All right. Why are they required, right? Well, number one, of course, they help programs get to know you, right? They help to illustrate the way that you meet the core competencies of that healthcare related program. They help to showcase your experience, your academic readiness, your commitment to the field, how much you know about the field, right? And of course, how prepared are you to start undertaking this whole endeavor? What are these core competencies, right? So, as we sort of shift towards holistic review, and most healthcare programs are doing this, right? There are kind of two most common application evaluation systems, right? One is point based, in which you have kind of like a checklist of prerequisites or qualifications, and you're given points based on kind of like how well you meet those qualifications, right? That can kind of lead to some inequities, as you might imagine. Some people are going to have some opportunities that other people don't. And so, therefore, you can see how that point system might kind of lead to a little bit more of a bias in that case, right? So, as a result, a lot of healthcare programs are turning towards holistic review, right? And holistic review is thinking more about how to treat each piece of the application more equitably. Each piece of the application kind of contributes to developing the picture of who you are as a whole full person, right? Not just your resume, not just a list of your experiences, but who you are and why you want to do this, right? Going alongside that, right, they've listed core competencies that are generally used to kind of determine whether applicants are kind of meeting these requirements for the program, right? So instead of being held to a standard that's like totally quantitative, right? 4.0 GPA, these grades and these classes or whatever, right? Holistic review kind of says, okay, we want you to be academically ready, but most importantly, we want you to display these competencies, right? So we're thinking about the way that this application evaluation system gives you the opportunity to explain bad grades or to frame your experiences in terms of your circumstances, right? So maybe you couldn't do all of this internship stuff, all of this shadowing stuff because you had to work part time to support your family or something like that, right? Holistic review gives you the opportunity to add that piece to your story and help kind of frame the way that your CV, your personal statement, your transcript looks to the admissions committees.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add to that is that if core competencies is a new terminology for you, I would highly recommend taking a little bit of time to look over the core competencies for the health profession that you're trying to pursue. So for medical school, you can look at the AAMC, AAMC. They have a really nice website about the medical school admissions core competencies. So highly recommend you read through that. And you can do the same thing for other health graduate schools. So physical therapy core competencies, dentistry core competency. Take a look at that, get familiar with the language that they're using there so that you can start thinking about how your skills and experiences translate to those core competencies. And also, this is what your letter writers are also going to be utilizing to assess you in terms of your readiness for health graduate school.
Mm-hmm. And we also have links to those professional organizations where they're going to list those things pretty much everywhere you see, right? It's going to be on Canvas. It's going to be on our website. There are those links to those professional organizations. Usually, if the name of the like profession is hyperlinked, it's a link to that professional org.
All right, so transitioning to talk about laying the foundation for letters of recommendation requests. So you may already be doing this. So whether you are freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, it's never too early or too late to start thinking about how you want to foster that relationship with faculty on campus. So of course, office hours is a really great way for you to begin establishing that rapport with faculty. So asking for clarification on assignments. Maybe there was a topic during lecture that you were really interested in. That's a really good opportunity for you to visit office hours and ask a little bit more about that topic. Professors, they love to nerd out. So anytime you get an opportunity to like go there and ask them questions, I'm sure they would be happy to talk to you about it. Other things that you can ask them about is career advice or ask them about their particular research. You could also be a little bit more direct and let them know what your goals and intentions are. Like if you want to get involved in research, let them know that that is your intention. If there's a particular area within research that you're interested in, let them know. Maybe they have connections to someone on campus that is looking for a research assistant. So it doesn't hurt to be direct about what your intentions are there. And also ask for help in connecting with resources on campus. If you're struggling in the course, it doesn't hurt to ask for help. If anything, that shows initiative, it shows determination, and it shows grit. And so that's a really good opportunity for you to show like who you are and what it is that you need. And of course, if you get the opportunity to improve your grade over the course of the term, that's still an opportunity for you to ask them for a letter of recommendation because it shows your ability to overcome challenging situations. And send follow-up emails. It's always really great to receive follow-up emails because it shows that you are good about communicating, and you're good about follow-up. So even if they don't respond, even if they're too busy to respond, that's absolutely okay. They can always go back to those emails when they're writing you that letter of recommendation and say, yeah, this person is really great about communication. They're very professional in the way they're communicating to me over email and in person from the interactions I've had. They have things that they can kind of build off from there. Okay. And of course, be intentional. So think about like where you're sitting within classes. If consider sitting at the front of the class, be the kind of person that is feeling comfortable to ask questions or answer questions, and then seek opportunities even outside the classroom. So thinking about getting involved in their research so you can continue to foster that relationship. Or maybe there isn't opportunities for research, that's fine. Consider becoming their teacher assistant or their grader for the course. That is another really great way for you to continue that long-term relationship. Or just mentorship, go to their office hours, ask them more questions about career advice, ask them more questions about what upper division courses you should consider taking. All of that is really great ways for you to continue that relationship.
I used to be an instructor, and I have to say, like, everybody wants students to go to office hours. Every single instructor would rather have students come to office hours and get help rather than turning in assignments that they like don't fully understand or anything like that. So it is really not embarrassing or shameful. It's a great way to get to know your professor. Many of you students, are really confused about how to do that. Go to office hours. And chances are instructors are like really bored during office hours, to be honest. They're really excited to see students.
All right. So who should write your letters of recommendation? So here we're going to talk about the logistics around this. So as Amanda mentioned, here at the University of Oregon, we don't do committee letters and we do not do letter packets. So that means that you are pivoting towards requesting individual letters of recommendation for your health graduate school applications. So with that being said, you need to be checking the minimum requirements for letters of recommendation for individual programs. And the amount you need for letters of recommendation is going to vary by the profession and by the program. Okay. So applying to public health programs or athletic training programs, the amount you need for those is going to look drastically different than the amount that you're going to need for medical school application. Okay. So questions that you should be asking yourself and looking at in terms of how many would be, do they require an academic letter of recommendation? Many of these programs do, but how many? And in addition to that, do they want specifically a science faculty letter of recommendation or non-science or both, or does it matter? So be paying very close attention to the language that they're using there in terms of the academic letter of recommendation. Okay. Do they require a letter of recommendation from a licensed practitioner? For some health graduate programs, it's a given that you're going to need a letter of recommendation from a licensed practitioner. So if you're applying to dental school or physical therapy school, that's a given. You're going to need a letter of rec from a practitioner. Okay. But other professions outside of that, it varies. So some athletic training programs require a letter of rec from a certified athletic trainer. If you're applying to DO school, so that is osteopathic medical school, some of those DO programs are going to require a letter of rec from a DO physician. Okay, so that's why it's really important that you're looking at the program as well, in addition to the profession. Okay. Are there exceptions? So if you've been taking a gap year or two, at some point there might be the minimum requirements might change for you. So I know for OHSU School of Medicine, if you've been out of school for like 4 or 5 years, their minimum letters of recommendations is going to look different than someone that has either is currently in undergraduate school or has recently graduated. So take a look at any sorts of exceptions that are offered outside of what is the minimum requirement. And yeah, so numbers vary school by school. So generally speaking, it's about 2 to 4 letters of recommendation for most health graduate programs. And then for medical school, in order for you to kind of meet the minimum requirements for most programs, we do recommend 3 to 6. So that is 2 science faculty letters of recommendation, 1 non-science, and then those other ones will be experiential ones. So letter of rec from the PI in your research lab, or maybe a supervisor in a volunteer organization, or maybe a physician that you shadowed or worked with in direct patient care. So that can look like a variety of different things. So generally speaking, about three to 6 for medical school, and then for other health graduate programs, it's going to vary somewhere between 2 to 4. Okay. I'm looking at the chat here. Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is, can I ask for a letter of recommendation from a coach? So they don't know you, so they know you personally, but you haven't interacted with them as a doctor. So they haven't seen you in that professional setting as you kind of observing them in their everyday work, or you know, working with them in direct patient care. So with that, I think that could be a good way to kind of round out your letters of recommendations, but not necessarily have that individual be someone that can highlight your clinical skills, if that's what you're hoping that they talk about. But if they've seen you kind of developed as an individual from like high school to college and after, and have seen that like personal development and your abilities to like maybe work in a team or to be a leader. Like that's a really great way for you to round out your letters of recommendation, but you definitely want to have your academic letters of rec and a few other ones in more of like professional settings. And that one can be like your other letter of rec. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would say you want to think about order here as well. So when you enter in your letter writer's contact info, it'll say like letter writer one, two, three, four, etc. Right? Follow the rule of thumb here that the ones that are on top are going to be the ones that are going to be read first, right? So you want your strongest letters to be first. You want these extra letters to be in that like number four, number five, number six slot. Because sometimes they don't read all of them, to be honest, right? They could read maybe two letters from your letter pile and say, oh, these are strong enough. We're fine. We're going to move on, in the process, right? They could read all of them, right? So you never really know. So just make sure to put your strongest ones at the top of the list there.
Yeah, Alexis. So I did say two science faculty letters of recommendation, one non-science, and then that other one would be one from experiential opportunities. So it could be a licensed practitioner, it could be a PI from a research lab, supervisor from a volunteer organization. It doesn't necessarily have to be a licensed practitioner unless it's required by the health graduate program that you're applying to. So that's my general rule of thumb if you're applying to medical school. But for most other health graduate school applications like PA, dentistry, it's going to be 2 to 4. So generally, like 1 to 2 academic and then 1 experiential. Okay. Going to transition to the next slide, but feel free to add more questions to the chat. All right, so how to select letters of who's going to write your letters of recommendation. So this is the distribution of that. So of course you want to think about quality over quantity. So for those academic letters of recommendation, think about faculty within the BCPM. So BCPM stands for biology, chemistry, physics, mathematics. And so these the instructors that fall within these categories are ones in which you want to consider for those science letters of recommendation. Okay. Outside of that, in terms of your experiential letters of recommendation, that can come from a variety of different places. So that could be research, volunteer, employment, and employment, whether that's healthcare or non-healthcare related. I think the most important takeaway that I want you to have from this slide is that if you have been working at Dutch Brothers for 2 years, and you've shadowed a physician for like 20 hours, between those two options, which one do you feel you should select? Personally, I would recommend that you select the Dutch Brothers supervisor because you've been working there for a long period of time. They can show your commitment, they can show your leadership, your ability to problem solve, etc. Right? And then a physician that has shadowed you for 20 hours, that's not a lot of hours. It's not a long-term experience. It may be limited. They may be limited in their ability to talk about you and your strengths and your characteristics. So quality over quantity is really important here.
And speaking of that, we've got a question in the chat about working in a lab, but not having taken a class from the PI, right? So if you work in a lab, but you haven't taken the class from the PI, it would not count as a science professor, right? Because think about it like this. They can't speak to your academic readiness because they've never graded your work, right? They can talk about how professional you are, right? And they can talk about how you learn stuff in that professional capacity for sure, but it's not going to cover the same kind of content as somebody who has been regularly reading your work as it's progressed through a class, right? So you want to think about coverage like that.
Mhm. Yeah. Any other questions around that? All right,
Yeah, all right. So, again, when you're thinking about how to choose who to ask, reflect on these questions, right? Again, you really want to go for how well do they know you and what do they know about you, right? Which one of your qualities can they talk about? For the most part, professors are going to be really ready and able to talk about your academic readiness, right? Your employers are going to be able to talk about your professionalism, your initiative, right? Your leadership qualities. A doctor that you might shadow might comment more specifically on your patient care philosophy and approach, right? So when you're thinking about this, you want to think about, do you have a variety of perspectives? Do you have somebody who is able to kind of recommend different parts of you, right? Who would count as science or non-science faculty? So pretty much any instructor with the word professor at the end of their title, right? So assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, right? Obviously, if they're teaching a science or a non-science class. I guess you could run into some trouble with some of those weird, like, is psychology a science? Social science, there could be some of that, right? Anthropology, I think, is also one that's like, is it a social science or a science? So there are some, kind of gray areas around there. But I would say usually that's not really an issue. If that is your issue, come in and talk to us about it, right? But generally, you want to look for tenured or tenure track professors who are teaching, those relevant classes, right? We're going to talk about GEs. We're going to talk about those kinds of relationships as well in just a second or two. Okay. Okay. So how do you ask for a letter, right? Ask early and politely, right? Remind them of your professional goals, interests, and experience. Give a concrete deadline. I get a lot of questions about whether or not it would be best to ask in person or through email. It really depends on your relationship with the person who's writing you this letter. If you have a really great relationship, you're very close, you have a jokey kind of, rapport, right? I would say you feel pretty safe asking in person, right? If it's somebody that you maybe don't know as well as you want to, I would say do it through email so that you can give them that chance to say no without having to look at your puppy dog eyes and and face you in that moment, right? A lot of times professors are just really busy and they literally might not have time to do it, and so it's nice to be able to give them that way to kind of gracefully say no to you, right, without feeling bad. So if you don't know them that well, send an email, bold the deadlines, right? Let them know, what the process is. Let them know that you're willing to send in any past work that you have, your resume, a draft of your personal statement if that's what they want, right? Many letter writers will ask for some of these materials again so that they can write you a really tailored and specific letter. They're also going to ask for instructions for how to submit your letter. That's going to vary depending on the program that you're applying to. But generally, the Common Application Portal will have a screen that asks you to put in the contact information of your letter writers, and then they're going to get an email link, right? Which with instructions for how to upload their letters. And there are a couple of different ways to do it. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Sometimes the centralized application system might have a guide to writing letters. For example, I think the double AMC has a little guide on like how to write a letter of recommendation for med programs, right? So you can also send that stuff as well. Follow up politely. I would say a good sort of realm of following up any sooner than a week is too soon, right? Always wait at least a week, unless the date is getting closer and closer and closer, right? We're maybe in the danger zone. We want to we want to turn up the heat a little bit. But usually you want to be following up, once every couple of weeks, once a month. Once it gets closer to your submission date, right? So once it gets within like a month and a half, we want to start, turning up the heat and maybe following up a little bit faster every week if they still haven't turned it in. And again, we'll talk about what to do if they haven't turned it in more towards the end of the presentation here. But basically, the goal is to keep reminding them in a very polite and chill way until it gets closer. And then if you start to have suspicions that they are not maybe working as fast as you want them to, make an appointment with us. We can help you work out a polite email to inquire about the status of your letter of rec and things like that.
Yeah, an additional tip here when it comes to asking for letters of recommendation. So if you're doing that over email, it might also be helpful to kind of outline why you feel they would be a good person to write you a letter of
Mm-hmm.
recommendation. Like, I'm making this request because I feel like you're able to talk about my capacity for improvement or my ability to lead a group, or my academic strengths. Like, detail exactly why you feel they are a good person to write you a strong letter of recommendation. I also recommend that you use the word strong, right? Because you want to request that, because you're requesting them to write you a letter of recommendation, but you want them to write you a strong letter of recommendation. So the question is here, are you able to write me a strong letter of recommendation, right? Because, at the end of the day, that is what you want and what you need, for health graduate school admissions. And so they can provide you an honest response to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a couple of questions in the chat. How early is too early to ask for a letter of rec? I would say that there is no too early, but there is a too late. You could ask a year in advance and then they would just say, like, okay, cool, remind me once it gets 6 months. You know what I mean? So there is never a too early, but there is a too late.
Mhm.
How soon can they actually send the letter to the application portal? Um, I think for most programs, if the application is open, they can actually start sending it in. Uh,
Yeah.
but it depends on whether or not your application is open. And I mean open to like fill out, not open for submission, right? That's generally the way that it goes.
Mhm. Yeah, if you're applying to medical school, for example, so right now we're still in the 2023-2024 application cycle. In May, that will close, and then quickly thereafter, the 2024-2025 application cycle will open, early May. Okay. So at that point, you're going to go in, you're going to create your account, you're going to start filling things out, and you're going to put in the name of your letter writers in there, and that's going to ping them an email so that they can submit that letter of recommendation. You can't do it sooner than that because we're not in that new cycle. If you were to do it sooner, they're essentially submitting a letter of rec for the previous cycle, and it's not going to roll over. Okay.
Mhm. Yeah, so basically once they get that upload link, they can send the letter.
Mhm. All right, and I guess that kind of led into this slide right here. So interfolio. So if you are med or dent applicant, then you can use interfolio to store your letters of recommendation. This is a service that you can pay for annually. It costs $59.99. And basically, instead of your letter writers sending the letter of recommendation to the centralized application portal, they're going to send it to Interfolio. And there's still a way for you to keep that letter of recommendation confidential, which is super important that you mark that you're going to keep the letter of recommendation confidential, because otherwise schools might not allow you to move forward in the process if you don't allow it to be confidential. Okay, super important there. But it can still maintain confidentiality through Interfolio, and then it would just send the letter of rec to Interfolio, and then you would be responsible to distributing it back out to the centralized application system. So this is really handy if you're applying to multiple MD program or medical programs. So if you're applying to MD, DO, and Texas medical schools, or at least two of those three, it's a nice way for you to lighten up the load on your letter writers. So instead of them getting a request from AMCAS to submit the letter of recommendation, and then from DO, and then from Texas Med, so they would have to submit it 3 different times. They're just getting one request through Interfolio. They're uploading it through there, and then you're responsible to distribute it out to AMCAS and NACOMAS and Texas Med. So that is really handy there. It's also really handy if you were to need to reapply, it could store it there, and then you could use it to reapply in the following year.
This is
Though,
also great for gap year people.
yes, for gap year people, that is a really good point there, Amanda. Yes, really great way for you to store that letter of recommendation as you're in those gap years. Um, though there are some programs that want like an updated letter of recommendation with like most current information. And so, there's pros and cons there in terms of storing that letter of recommendation. But really great service if you're considering that. Letters by liaison, that is the company that manages those letters of recommendation. So when you are instructing your letter writer in terms of how to upload that letter of recommendation, you can just let them know you're going to receive an email from Letters by Liaison, letting you know that you were instructed to upload a letter of recommendation for X candidate, etc. And so they'll create a login, and then within that portal, they can upload that letter of recommendation. Once they hit submit, they cannot make any edits to that submitted letter of recommendation. So they just need to make sure that they are submitting the most finalized letter of recommendation for you. With that being said, there are some centralized application systems where it allows you to use that same letter of recommendation for all of the different programs you're applying to. So I'm talking to physical therapy applicants in the room. When you're applying to PT school, you are requesting a letter of recommendation per program. So if you're applying to OSU Cascades and then a few other programs, they're going to receive an invitation for them to upload a letter of recommendation from every single one of those programs. So that's a lot. But when they log into Letters by Liaison and upload one, they can use that one to send it off to all of those other programs as well. So they don't have to upload like 15 different ones. They can just use that one. So that might be an important thing to let your letter writers know, that they don't have to submit multiple.
Mm-hmm. All right, there's a question in the chat. How long will, I'm going to assume, Interfolio store them for? Do letters of recommendation expire? So Interfolio will store them for however long your account, exists, right? But letters of recommendation do expire. Usually schools will say that they want letters of recommendation that are within like 2 to 3 years for the most part. And there could be exceptions to this, of course, right? So, do your research. But usually 2 to 3 years is kind of like the line there. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about letters, right? And we've been saying a lot of like what letters that you cannot get, right? So you can't get committee letters, right? You can't get letter packets. But if you have a GE that you know really well, you can ask them if they would be willing to cooperate with the lead instructor to co-write a letter together, right? So everyone always asks if they can have their GE write a letter. And the thing is that your GE knows you better than anyone, for sure. But GEs are not professional, right, in the eyes of these applications, as you may think, right? They are pretty much just students, just like you, right? A GE at that level is a grad student, but they don't have that terminal degree that gives them that kind of professional weight, right? So ultimately, a GE's word is going to mean way less than somebody who is tenure track or tenured already. So that's why we ask for them to cooperate with the lead instructor to write a letter. Also, committee letters of recommendation writing is actually not really in the GE sort of like work contract. So they have actually like no obligation to do it, right? So like a professor and instructor can't like force the GE to do it. So it is a good idea to ask if the GE would be willing and if the lead instructor feels comfortable cooperating with them to write that letter together. If you're taking a gap year, some letter writers may ask you to write the letter and then send it for them to sign. This is a tricky situation because on the one hand, it's really beneficial because you can actually, what's going to be in the letter, right? You know the content of the letter, and you can also make sure that it's strong, right? But it is also really scary because, of course, you don't know how to write a letter, and that is a really frightening task, I think, for many undergrads, right? So number one, the double AMC has a guide for writing these letters, which can be adapted. Number two, again, schedule an appointment with us. We can kind of go over your draft before you send it to your letter writer, right? Okay, and then like I said, if you're taking a gap year or two, you want to request your letters prior to graduating or really soon after graduation. Of course, remember that professors see literally hundreds of students every 10 weeks, right? Every 10 weeks is a new batch of like 400 students, so you want to do it pretty soon. You want to work with your letter writer to determine how they'd like to approach the gap year, right? How often do they want you to stay in touch? What's their, what's the best way for you to stay in touch? Stay connected with them throughout the year, right? Send them an email around Christmas to ask them, how their holidays are going and to check in with them. Another thing that you can do to kind of sweeten the deal for these letter writers is to tell them what you're going to be doing during your gap year and to let them know that you're willing to talk to any students who want to do the same thing, right? So a lot of students will, go out and work jobs in healthcare, or maybe you're securing like a research assistant position at OHSU, right? Having you as a resource for students to be able to give tips on what that process is like is super valuable to professors. So if you feel like, you feel bad for asking them for this and not giving anything in return, give that offer, right? Tell them that you'd be happy to speak with any students who have questions about this process. That's a huge ask. And it's really nice, I think, to kind of pay it forward like that. Not much, effort on your end. Okay. So here are the most common issues, right? So number one, I do want to make it clear that it is highly, highly likely that you're going to have one letter writer who is really going to stress you out. They're going to wait until the very last second to respond. They might not respond to any of your follow-up emails. There's a high likelihood that this will happen, right? Number one, don't panic, right? If there's only one letter writer who hasn't completed their letter of recommendation, most of the time your application will be sent for review anyways, right? As long as you've got a couple of letters in. So if you're just missing one, again, make an appointment. Let's talk about how to, gently remind them very quickly about these things. But also, if it's just one person who's not responding to you and your other letter writers are on top of it, take a deep breath. You can relax a little bit. We can work it out, right? There is a danger zone where you want to be aware of when it's kind of the moment to ask somebody new to write a letter, right? When is the moment where you realize that this letter writer isn't going to have the time or isn't going to do it at all, right? So I would say, too late to ask somebody for a letter of rec. A month is too late, right? A month is not a very long time for people to have notice to write something like this, right? So at that month and a half, right? A month and a half before you submit your application, you want to make sure that you've gotten, confirmation from people, right? Strong confirmations. If you don't get any, response from somebody at that point, and you email them, the next week and still no response, right? That is the time to start looking around for a backup letter writer. Worst case scenario, you have an extra letter that you can, add to your pile, put it at the, at the bottom, right? No worries there, right? If your letter writer said no, again, it is not necessarily because they don't want to recommend you personally. Okay, don't take it like that, right? It could be that they're too busy, right? Remember that many faculty members are doing research, applying for grants, and doing all this other stuff on top of teaching, right? Similarly, a lot of doctors get really busy with appointments and patients, Sometimes they're really just not going to have the time to be able to write you one that's going to do you any justice. So if they say no, thank them very much and then move on and ask somebody else, right? So you do want to develop a kind of roster of like, who could your backup options be, right? If your letter writer has ghosted you, right? Number one, get in contact with us as soon as possible, right? We can discuss the situation. When was the last time you heard from them? What did they say at that time, right? If they are teaching at UO, maybe we can ask around the department to see if, there's anything going on, right? Maybe they got sick suddenly or something like that. You never know, right? So come in, make an appointment with us. Let's talk about what to do. But again, generally, if they started to ghost you, do not depend on them, right? If they're not responding to any of your communications, I think it's much safer to go ahead and contact one of your backup letter writers and start making those plans, right? Okay, and then your letter writer has not received the link to upload. Number one, ask them to check their spam. They do get sent there because it is an automated email from, like a big application service, right? So it's highly likely that it could end up in their spam. Two, they have options to resend the link, right? Three, get in touch with the customer service at that common application service. You really never know. It might be a weird coding thing that you have like literally no control over, right? So if you are really resending the link and your letter writer still hasn't received it, they've checked their spam, they've checked everything, all of that, get in touch with the application portal in person. They have a variety of ways to contact them. It's like email, chat, phone number, right? Get them on the phone, let them know what's going on, and they can help you out. Other questions or worries about issues? Okay, well, requesting letters of rec is scary, but it's necessary, and they really can make a huge difference in your application. Um, a lot of admissions committees will really rely on what professors tell them because they themselves are professors who are going to be teaching you, right? They want to make sure that they have students that they like and that they want in their class. So letters are a big deal. You do want to devote some time to making sure that they are going to be strong and they're really going to showcase you. And the time to start, if you're applying for this cycle, is pretty much right now, right? So if you haven't asked for letters yet, you should, get started on it or at least get started on a plan. Come by and schedule an appointment if you're really worried about that, right? If you don't know who to ask, all of that kind of stuff, schedule an appointment with us. Let's talk about it. Okay, so it doesn't seem like there are any other questions. If you do have questions, again, put them in the chat. Let us know. But other than that, thanks very much for coming by, y'all. As always, we're going to put up this recording on YouTube and then on the pre-health advising canvas. Um, Please note that our availability is going to get pretty limited because no, yes, next 2 weeks, we're all going to be on drop-in. And so we won't have appointments coming up. If it's something really urgent, I encourage you to email us or reach out to the front desk and let them know kind of what's going on and we can figure out how to squeeze you in. Um, but I would say maybe, take the next 2 weeks to just kind of start working on your personal statement and stuff. And then once appointments open back up after those 2 weeks, come in and talk to us about these issues, right? Right now there really shouldn't be too many emergencies as applications really haven't opened yet, right? But of course, anything could happen, if something does, reach out, let us know.
Yeah, and if you have any immediate questions, feel free to connect with us during drop-in advising. We'll be there.
Oh yeah, yeah. You can always come to the front desk and tell them that you're here for pre-health on those drop-in days as well.
Mhm. All right, y'all. Thank you all for being here. All right, have a good one. Thank you.